Welcome to Whiskey Ace. I'm your host, Mike Gill. So last week in episode 2 we covered distillation, but I left one thing out just on purpose because we talked about the malting floors, and there's only 7 distilleries left and some of them don't use them all the time. So the old-fashioned method that we all love. So I just want to cover that very quickly because there's one component that we need to talk about in depth, which is peat. So malting floor, we have the 40% moisture. It's been turned over for days by strong men, and it then goes to the kiln, and we get the peat, and we put the peat and we make a fire. And with that fire, we don't want flame, so we don't want fire as you think of it. We want smoke, which peat is fantastic at doing, and that smoke will then rise into the kiln, dry out the barley, and the phenols from the smoke will actually mingle with the barley husks. They attach themselves, like I say, married for life, and we get that actually in our PT 12, 15, 18-year-old. It's still there, which is kind of really amazing. So you see that when you see pagoda roofs in distilleries, most of them today aren't working, which is a bit of a shame. But if you see the smoke coming out of steam coming out of a pagoda roof, you know that they're still doing it the old-fashioned way, which is really, really nice. So peat, which has its own terroir, which is what I want to really talk about today. Here's peat. Yeah. Now, I have no idea the age of this peat, which is from Islay. But, 360 million years comes to mind, because we had peat bogs in Bronze Age, Ice Age, etc. And if you imagine, it's all the organic matter that's in these wetlands, bogs, and it just can't decompose. And so it does take quite a long time. And if you think of this as, I sometimes call young coal, it's amazing how old coal must be. And when I think of on my mother's side, a lot of my relatives were miners, Yorkshire miners, just how old that coal is. Amazing. So, peat and its terroir. So, story comes to mind, coolies, when they first formed a new distillery in Ireland, to be the first in a long, long time to produce single malts. I know that the distillery manager was so meticulous about having the right taste profile that he couldn't find the right peat in Ireland. And there's a lot there. And they ended up finding it, I think, in Wick. So distilleries are very particular about where the peat comes from and exactly the profile they're looking for. And I mentioned Simpsons, and there's Port Ellen, there's lots of malting companies that do this for the distillery now. But the distillery does say where the peat has to come from. Highland Park, which we're going to talk about in a second, has a more 7 miles away that they own, just because that's the peat that they want. So Islay, they tend to go deeper when they're digging, and it certainly has more phenols. Highland Park, Orkney is kind of somewhere in the middle, with lots of floral. They dig a little bit shallower, gets a lot more of that heather in there, and then mainland is milder, is less. So what I want to talk about, or what I'd like to do, is to show you the difference, the influences that you can get from peat and from different parts of the country. And I have today Bowmore 12 and Highland Park 12. So we have Islay, Orkney, with a much different peat influence. And if you look on the scale of phenols per million is how they gauge it, Highland Park would be somewhere around 15 phenols per million, Bowmore would be 25, and then we're up to the Lagavulins, the Laphroaigs, the Ardbegs, which are 40 plus. So these two today are still on the mild side, but very, very different. And for anybody wanting to get into peaty whiskies, these two are amazing to start with. So the Bowmore 12, when you nose it, you immediately get a mixture of maritime and smoke, peat, smoky. And that's how to think of it. It's a mixture of the two. So we're going to get sea spray, seaweed, iodine, and that lovely smoky with a little bit of sweetness. Okay, on the Highland Park, so much more floral, the heather that I talked about. And if you remember last week, we did Glenlivet 12, which was the, is one of the easiest to nose and taste. And you're looking for those three elements that I talked about. So what we'll do now is we'll just see if we can find the others. And I did mention you should get the fruit. So on Bowmore 12, you get lemon, which was from the esters, a lot of that in the foreshots. Highland Park, totally different, orange. So we've nailed those. Also, you got the vanilla on the Bowmore 12 from the ex-bourbon cask, with a little bit of sherry, I think, at the end. On Highland Park, more sherry influence, and certainly still got a kind of a vanilla, but it's probably more it's more creme brulee type, but bags of honey. And then on the third, you have the cereal, which I said was much harder to describe. On the Bowmore, still pretty hard for me to describe. It's there though, it's definitely malty. On the Highland Park, because of the smoke, it's sort of like burnt toast. That would be the easiest way to describe it. Yeah, probably burnt toast. So that gives you an idea of how influential peat is. Next week we'll be covering casks, which as yet I'm not sure how many episodes you need on casks. It's a very complex part of what makes a single malt whiskey even greater. So until next time, see you later.